Hello and welcome to a new episode here on the War of the Rebellion podcast for Age Civil War. Today, we are meeting some stereotypes and be Irish. I hope you have your Guinness ready for today's episode because we are going to talk about the Emerald Island. And joining me today is Patrick O'Malley. He is professor of English. I have to watch myself here, one of my newest directions. He is a professor of English at Georgetown University. He has a PhD from Harvard in English language and literature. He also has published Catholicism, Sexual Deviance, and Victorian Gothic Culture. Sounds very interesting. And we're just going to immediately here get to his newest book, which is published by the University of Virginia Press, The Irish and the Imagination of Race, White Supremacy Across the Atlantic in the 19th Century, which came out late last year. But first of all, thank you so much, Patrick, for joining me here today on the podcast. And I don't think either one of us has a Guinness
Not
with us
yet, but
today.
not yet, but maybe by the end we can celebrate together.
We'll see.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm really delighted
You're
to be here and to chat with you about the book. I'm also pretty excited about being interviewed by a historian, and grateful to you for inviting a lit guy into the conversation.
oh,
So thank you very much for that, and
my
I'm looking forward
pleasure.
to our talk.
Yeah, my pleasure. It's something that HNet has been talking about for a while to reach out, and I think when it comes to history and literature, we're very close to each other in many ways, after all. So, but before we get into like what you do specifically professionally here with literature, tell us about how did you get interested in the Irish? You mentioned before we talked that you had like this childhood brief stay in Scotland. Was that sort of something that got you, or like how did you get interested in the Irish?
Well, my name is Patrick O'Malley, and so that is a way in which but I'm American.
Mhm.
I was born in the United States. I was born in New York City, but I think that my name has always, in a way, um, created various kinds of preconceptions in other people
Mhm.
about me and who I am and where I'm from. So um, it's it's been something. Irishness has been something that's been pretty interesting uh, to me, and that I've been interested in for my whole life. I have family in Ireland, mostly in the west of Ireland,
Mhm.
uh, that we visited when I was a kid. I think this particular project, in a way, emerged out of my previous book, which is actually the book um, after the one that you mentioned, about Catholicism and sexual deviance in Victorian Gothic culture. When it One thing that I found is that in my work, I guess each book after the first has been, in a way, a kind of return to and wrestling with
Mhm.
some problem that was manifested in the previous book,
Mhm.
and that I dealt with in some kind of way, but that I wasn't really satisfied with.
Yeah, yeah.
And so after Catholicism, Sexual Deviance in Victorian Gothic Culture, which was a book about the uses of Gothic imagery and Gothic language through the 19th century, actually, but especially in the second half of the 19th century. I got pretty interested in the question of why so many of the writers I was writing about
Mhm.
were Irish Protestants. And
Mm.
and this goes back to one of the books that's been a recurring book in almost everything I've written, which is a book called Melmoth the Wanderer by the Irish Church of Ireland minister Charles Robert Maturin, who was Oscar Wilde's uncle by marriage. So there's a
Oh,
really interesting kind of connection there
oh,
across the century. But in 1820, he publishes what becomes a kind of standard iconic book
mm,
of Gothic called Melmoth the Wanderer. So there's him. Later in the century, Dion Boucicault publishes a play called The Vampire or The Phantom that I was sort of glancingly interested in Catholicism, sexual deviance, and Victorian Gothic culture, and but also around 1870, Sheridan Le Fanu, another Irish Protestant writer,
mm,
writes a series of kind of Gothic short stories, but also one called Carmilla, which has sometimes been identified as the first lesbian vampire story,
mm,
uh, and um, and that was pretty well known, and pretty influential. And then, of course, at the end of the century, in the 1890s, there is Oscar Wilde himself with The Picture of Dorian Gray and Bram Stoker with Dracula. All
mm,
of these Irish Protestant writers were becoming major figures in this first book, and
mm,
I tried to think about why that might be.
mm,
Uh, I had a bit of an answer, right, about the divided self
mhm,
and about sort of like the conflicts of kind of like doubleness, right, and sort of
mhm,
like dual allegiances um in that first book, as well as the kind of like the Gothic question of the return of the repressed, right, like
mhm,
historical violence coming back in various ways. But I wasn't really satisfied with it, and I wanted to think more about it. And so the second book, which is titled Liffey and Lethe, Paramnesiac History in 19th Century Anglo-Ireland,
I'm
uh,
glad you
was
said that.
was actually a sort of study of the of how to account for um, kind of like unresolved historical violence um, in
Mm,
Irish literature and
wow,
especially in Irish historiography of
yeah.
the 19th century.
Mm,
And so it was a way of kind of like coming back to this question of like, why are all these
right,
Gothic
yeah.
writers, these Irish Protestants, but to take history a little bit more seriously and to think about the
Mhm,
ways that they're actually thinking about history,
yeah.
but also thinking about a kind of mismatch
Mhm,
between the sort of unresolved wounds of Irish
mhm,
history and
right.
literary generic conventions, which try to, in some ways, kind of um, create, kind of pressure towards
Mhm,
closure, towards like
right,
having a
right,
story that has a beginning, a
yeah.
middle, and end. And what does it mean to be writing those kinds of stories especially if you're writing about history and historical events,
Mhm,
if you're living in a period which doesn't understand its history as closed, right?
right.
And how does that work? So that's what that book became. And I realize this is now a very long answer to your question about how this third book came about. Um, but what actually happened was that I had a kind of in that book in Liffey and Lethe, I had a chapter on vampires, and vampires in
Mm,
relationship to the famine. Um, and the ways in which certain kinds of representations of vampiric hunger, right, might be related to representations, both literary but then also journalistic, of starving Irish people, especially in the west of Ireland, as
mm,
skeletons or otherwise kind
yeah,
of undead, living on. And um,
Oh,
and so there's a that chapter brought together again Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla with Diane Boucicault's Vampire. And I had a kind of throwaway line there about John Mitchell,
oh.
the Irish sort of seditionist
Yeah.
and nationalist and transportee and activist in
Mhm.
all kinds of ways. I had a sort of throwaway line there about him in relationship to Boucicault. But I got kind of like super interested in and it started going down a kind of rabbit hole of these odd um, parallels between Mitchell and Boucicault um, as they traveled, and especially in the United States in the 1850s. And so they're both Irish Protestant writers. They're from different parts of Ireland and different types of Protestantism, but both Irish Protestant writers, both writers who have real significance both in Ireland and in what they do in the United States. Um, they both arrive in New York City. I mean, in complicated ways. I mean, it's easier for Boucicault. Boucicault just goes. Mitchell is first transported to,
Yeah.
as you know, right, to Van
Yeah, it's a
Diemen's
bit
Land
longer
and
journey for
long
him.
journey, right? And then ends up on the West Coast and then comes across. But they
He
both
took a
arrive in New
long
York.
way around.
It's a long way around, right? But they both arrive in New York City in the last months of 1853. So they're
Mm,
both kind of like getting there at the same time.
mm,
In 1855, Boucicault temporarily moves to the enslaving state of Louisiana. Mitchell becomes a farmer in the enslaving state of Tennessee. In 1858, they're both in Washington, D.C., which is my home, and
wow.
where my academic institution is. They're both here in 1858. They're both back in New York in overlapping ways in the
Mhm,
1870s. They both write about American enslavement of people
mhm,
of African descent, although incredibly different ways. And that was the knot that I was coming back to as I was going down this kind
mhm,
of like rabbit hole of like trying to figure out, where were they living in, 1858 and how did they overlap? Um, was why does Boucicault why does Boucicault write about race and enslavement in the context of the United States in the way that he does?
mhm,
And why does Mitchell write about it in the way that he does?
mhm,
Even while I mean, especially for Mitchell, more complicated for Boucicault. We could think of them both as sort of literary nationalists
mhm,
within the Irish
yeah.
context, and so this became a kind of like persistent sort of like question for me, kind of like this
Mhm,
thing that I was turning over in my mind. And of course, part of it is their own, who they are as people,
right.
right? That's definitely part of it. Their background, their how they come to the questions, right?
Yeah.
You can't discount the absolutely personal. Um,
Yeah.
but I also, and this is why I think I, as a kind of lit person, came to this. I started to think about it as also a question of genre.
Mhm,
And we can talk a little bit more about the way the genre works in the book, but but I started to think about it that it's not just that Mitchell chooses to write about race American and the American enslavement of people of African descent, in the form of the polemical tract,
Hmm.
and Boucicault does it in the form of the stage melodrama. I mean, that's where they come from, right? And so
Hmm.
that's the
Right.
genres that they're using. Um, but I started to think about the ways in which those genres actually also shape the way they think about these questions, right? So
Mm.
so that the genres aren't just reflections of the thought which came first,
Mm.
right? And the clothes in which the thought that came first, puts on. But
Sort
that
of
the
a
genre
chicken and egg
chicken
situation,
and egg
right?
situation, right? And this went back to the kind of question in a way that I was asking in my second book, which was sort of like how do how, when you're writing a historical novel, say,
Hmm.
right? How does the fact that it's a historical novel and not history
Right.
affect the way that you think about the relationship of
Mhm.
the past to the present?
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Not only that, oh, hey, I'm the kind of person who writes historical novels, but as opposed to history, right?
Yeah.
But that
Yeah.
you start to think about the arc of history in different kinds of ways,
Hmm.
right? Because the genres have various kinds of expectations that you're writing with, but you're also writing
Hmm.
against, that you're
Yeah.
thinking about, that you're thinking with. If you're Boucicault and you need to sell tickets to a play, that's a
Right.
really different kind of
Hmm.
sort of like generic imperative than someone like Mitchell, who is kind of like opening up his
Hmm.
own presses to like publish his newspapers. Um,
Right.
so so I started to think about genre in that way, and then start to think, oh wow, these genres are actually really interesting, and there's sort of a series of them.
Yeah.
That a series of kind of generic forms or modal forms
Hmm.
in which some of these Irish nationalist writers take on the kind of question of of race and American enslavement, and forms of the political polemic, and the stage melodrama, but also forms like the Gothic and the Bardic poem, and the national tale.
Yeah.
So that became the heart of this new project.
Yeah. Well, that is a long story, but
Yes, yeah,
it's an
sorry about the long
interesting
story.
story to kind of like. I mean, it's always the case, right? Sometimes we have these moments where it's like, ooh, there's this unanswered question or something we didn't have the ability to flesh out in our first or second or third book, and we go back to it in some form. But one thing I want to like before we get more into the book and the subject matter, I wanted to kind of give you a chance to talk about as well, because like very early on in the correspondence to set this up, you kind of pointed out nicely and kind of was a little concerned that you're not a historian, but you are a literary critic.
Mhm.
So what does that mean? Let's start with that. Like, what does it mean? What, like, maybe how do you approach your sources differently, or how do you approach the subject, and how do you then take like a book by John Mitchell or Boudico, and what how do you read it?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting question, and um, one of the things that I have the sort of privilege and honor to do at Georgetown over the past several years, actually, is co-teach a class with a colleague who's a historian,
Hmm.
and the class is actually focused on the 18th century rather than
Okay.
the 19th. But it's under the rubric in the College of Arts and Sciences at Georgetown. It's a first year seminar,
Hmm.
and
Okay.
it's under the rubric of what's called ways of knowing. And one of
Mm.
um, the kind of uh, fundamental questions or animating questions of the class, even as we're teaching together, we're always in the
Mhm.
classroom together with students together.
Yeah.
We're reading the same works.
Mhm.
Is what are the different what are the different ways in which, someone who's trained as a historian,
Mhm.
might approach the same, let's say, a work of literature in a different way than someone who's trained as a literary critic,
Yeah.
and also
Hmm.
how would a literary critic maybe similarly or maybe in a different way approach some kind of archival document,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
A letter or a um, or a polemical tract or a
Yeah.
medical journal or
Yeah.
or
Pamphlet.
anything else, a pamphlet or
Yeah.
anything else that we might find, because it's certainly the case that a lot of historians, right,
Hmm.
engage with literature, right,
Right.
and do
Yeah.
so in really, really wonderful, and I think
Yeah.
enlightening and revelatory ways, um, and at least for quite a while now. I mean, the sort of question of historical context,
Mm.
uh, other sort of like archival or historical documents have been important to at least um, many sort of strands of literary study, although certainly not all. So there's a lot
Hmm.
of ways in which we're reading the same stuff,
Yeah.
right? I and I don't want to overstate the differences, except as a kind of as a sort of apology from the beginning that I'm sort of in awe of the things that historians know, and keep in their minds at all points that I always find more difficult. Um, but I think um, that this isn't necessarily a difference, but it's a
Hmm.
kind of it's a sort of degree of emphasis,
Okay.
and that from I'd say that one way in which there are kind of like methodological ranges
Hmm.
is that when I approach literary texts, even though I'm really interested in their relationship to the historical, um, I'm I'm interested in that, and again, many historians are, of course, as well. Not only as a symptom of the history, right?
Hmm.
That there's some kind of like historical event, a war,
Right.
right, or a migration, or a
Hmm.
famine,
Right. Sort of not
or
just reading them as sort of like an
yeah, and
account
then
of this
an account
period.
of this period,
Hmm.
or even symptomatic of the
Yeah.
period, right? Which absolutely they can be,
Yeah.
right? But also as shaping the way in which people in the period thought, the kind
Hmm.
of the kinds of kind of like the literature and literature broadly here provided a kind of um various kinds of forms of
Hmm.
thought about things that are happening in the
Right.
world, right? And in literary studies, I mean, like one of the although this isn't the subject of this book, but one of the ways in which literary critics have been really interested in that is thinking about, for example, gender relationships,
Hmm.
or kind of like in the 18th century and coming into the 19th century, and sort of thinking about a a writer, an incredibly influential writer, or someone like Jane Austen, as not only um, reflecting
Hmm.
kind of like understandings of gender relations at the turn of the 19th century, but also providing a kind of grammar for gender relations going forward,
Mm.
that
Hmm.
her novels in a way shape the way that we think about what love is, not
Right.
only not
Yeah.
only reflecting, right, so that
Yeah.
changes of what love is, right? So
Yeah.
that's one of the ways. So that's not part of this book, but that kind of question. And that's why so I'm, as a literature guy, right, I'm really interested in thinking about the work that literary form
Hmm.
does,
Yeah.
Right, the cultural work
Yeah.
that literary form itself does.
Right.
So
Sort of like why is a book a bestseller, and why do school kids have to keep reading this book forever and
sure,
ever,
right,
right? Because
yeah, right.
it shapes it sh sort of like it's shaped by a generation, but it then shapes another generation.
It absolutely shapes another generation, and in
Yeah.
some kind of like deep and kind
Mm-hmm.
of complicated way, it shapes what we understand as truth.
Yeah.
Right. It shapes as we
Yeah.
understand as kind of like the true and the meaningful,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Oh
And
yeah.
so so at first when I was working on this book, I was
Yeah.
kind of thinking about genre in a relatively schematic way. I have to
Mm-hmm.
say that is I was actually I was thinking about, okay, we've got these let me think about a gothic novel or a gothic right kind of
Right.
like
Yeah.
tale or a realist novel or something like that
Mm-hmm.
that is about America and race and
Mm-hmm.
enslavement. And I was particularly interested in genres that had been important in the early part of the 19th century and also in the late 18th century to Irish nationalist
Mm-hmm.
aspiration,
Yeah.
right? So I was really interested in genres that kind of had become kind of iconic
Mm-hmm.
Irish nationalist
Right.
genres
Right.
in some way or other. And then I was kind of interested in tracing the ways in which they either did or didn't
Mm-hmm.
um, um, effectively translate this kind of liberationist conviction into the context of American race-based chattel enslavement and the white
Right.
supremacy that both
Sure.
subtended it and
Yeah.
outlived it. So that was a kind of literal and literary understanding of genre and its relevance to 19th century understandings of race. But as I was working on the book, I realized that there was a second and probably more important way in which genre and race speak to each other, and that's that they both name these culturally and ideologically
Mm-hmm.
inflected categories.
Right.
They're both constructed categories, by which I
Mm-hmm.
mean that um, they're not essential, right?
Mm-hmm.
They don't precede the discourse about them, right?
Okay.
But are produced by the and through the discourse
Mm-hmm.
about them. Um,
Right.
but they also, even as they're constructed, they're deeply influential on
Mm-hmm.
the way that we understand the world around us, right?
Okay.
They are stories that become
Mm-hmm.
truth in various kinds of ways for the
Yeah.
way that we see the world around us. So they they articulate and enforce
Mm-hmm.
at the same time really powerful forms of relationality.
Yeah.
And so this became really interesting to me, right? Because I started to think like, wow, this is so like there's literary genre in this important way, and and also race is relational in a
Mm-hmm.
kind of way that's sort of like similar to and to this kind of this sort of like generic understanding. And here's where I mean, there were a number of really important scholars of color, especially who helped me sort of like think
Right.
about this relationship. People like Yogita Goyal and Brigitte Fielder and Mark Jung
Mm-hmm.
really helped me kind of like who've written about this
Right.
and kind of like often coming to the question from a kind of literary background and sort of like thinking
Mm-hmm.
about the ways in which form really matters to productions of race. Um, so so that's really sort of like how I um, came to think that both genre in a kind of um, almost in a kind of in this kind of schematic way,
Mm-hmm.
right? There are particular genres that I'm interested in tracing
Right.
mattered here. Um, and I come to the genres as a literary critic, but also thinking about um, kind of like the forces of form and the way that the way that the kind of imperatives of category work on our
Hmm.
minds, sometimes in some kind of damaging ways, right?
Hmm.
And that I wanted to both understand in the 19th century and its aftermath, which I think is continuing today,
Right.
and right,
Yeah,
and
no.
also to maybe try to name and ideally disrupt.
Yeah. No, I kind of when you were talking, I wonder, it's sort of like when you talk about these genres and authors that are in these genres, are these genres that the author would have been like, I'm part of this, or was it kind of just they had read people that wrote something similar and they kind of adopted that style and we later like attached sort of a genre to, or later literary critics attached a genre to them? Would they have been kind of like educated by like kind of thinking of like a person that goes to a certain school and there's this big critic and that's sort of their upbringing, so they kind of follow that kind of like style, or do they kind of like how did they come to this to these
Yeah,
styles, to
yeah.
these genres?
I mean, that's the, yeah, right. I mean, sometimes very, very specifically, um, and sometimes
Hmm.
more, um, is sort of like the, the air that they
Right.
breathe, right? In a way, right? I mean, there's a way in which, um, if I mention some sort of genre, right? Like um the Western or something like that
Right. Yeah.
for
Yeah.
right for film. All
Yeah.
right. There's
We
things
all
we
have an
don't
image in mind.
we all have an image in mind, right? And we
Yeah.
don't necessarily have to have taken a class on the Western, but
Hmm.
we've somehow it's somehow, and we can even start to recognize ways in which a kind of mode of the Western can show
Hmm.
up in films that aren't Westerns,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
In science fiction, for example, we could say, hey, there's that is drawing on a kind of tradition, maybe consciously, maybe,
Right.
not.
Yeah.
Um, but some of them, I'd say, are in fact, um, specific. There are
Hmm.
writers and I try to draw that out in some ways in the book. So for example, um someone like Edgar Allan Poe, who I write about in a chapter of the book, was not only really interested in um certain kinds of Irish literature, and in particular um, the the poet, Thomas More, who became one of the most um, most read
Hmm.
Irish poets in the
Oh
United
yeah.
States,
Yeah.
in the 19th century. But Poe also makes a joke about the novel that I mentioned before, Melmoth the Wanderer by Charles Robert Maturin, in a review which is about something completely different. But that someone like Poe has thought about
Hmm.
a gothic novel like
Right.
Melmoth, and so then I think that we can kind of, um, and when he writes, when he in the review, when he mentions um Melmoth, it's actually a kind of reference to
Hmm.
form, and to Melmoth's this kind of labyrinthine, kind of eternal labyrinthine structure
Right.
of this novel that fails to finish itself in a lot of ways. Um, and so he does seem to be thinking about Irish Gothic, right, in a
Hmm.
particular kind of
Right.
way.
Right.
And others as well. There's a American poet, in addition to Poe, who I write about, a pro-slavery South Carolina poet, and also congressional representative from South
Yeah.
Carolina, this William Grayson, and
Hmm.
um, he writes um, he writes a poem called "The Hireling and the Slave," um, and I think so in something like "The Hireling and the Slave," I mean the fact that that title actually comes from the
Yeah.
Star Spangled Banner
Yeah.
is a particular kind of um, allusion to a sort of national poetry, right?
Hmm.
Like even by the 1850s, um, and that he's using
Hmm.
that kind of like specific allusion. But it's also the case that in the preface to the hireling and the slave, he actually alludes to this body of poetry from Irish history that had been attributed. I mean, there's actually a long and complicated history of forgery, but had been attributed to the Irish bard Oisin, or Ocean, and that kind of allusion there seems to me to also suggest that someone like Grayson is in a way self-consciously putting his poem into
Hmm.
dialogue with um this genre of kind of what sometimes called bardic nationalism, that became really important in Irish nationalist literature, and Scottish as well, in the late 18th century and early 19th century. Some other times it seems to be imposed. There's a writer, there's a novel I write about called The Garys and Their Friends, which is by a Black American novelist named Frank Webb, um, and in the 1850s. And one of the sort of both dispiriting and also kind of eye-rolling moments of working on Webb is reading the British reviews of his novel.
Hmm.
It was published in England. It couldn't be published in the United States, and the only major American review was actually in Frederick Douglass's journal, which was a reprint of an English review. But these English reviewers again and again keep kind of like trying to pigeonhole what Webb is doing into categories that they recognize. So
Hmm.
they keep on kind of saying like he's like Dickens in this way, but not in that, right? Or
Right.
he's read
Yeah.
too much Thackeray, right? Or and
But again,
and
sort of the influencing each other and
this
jazz.
right in various
Yeah.
ways, or the assumption of
Yeah.
a certain kind of influence.
Yeah.
Um, there's a when I so that book, that novel, the Garys and Their
Hmm.
Friends, which I think is a really amazing novel that everyone should read,
Yeah.
has an Irish character in it
Hmm.
named McCloskey, and he's a kind of he's a sort of enforcer. He's a kind of brute character, um, and I actually came to the Garys and Their Friends after I had read and thought about Boucicault's
Hmm.
play, the Octoroon, um, which has a character named McCloskey as well, who's also he's a sort of overseer of an estate in Louisiana, and is a kind of brutal figure,
Hmm.
although in a somewhat different way than Webb's McCloskey. Um, and I have to admit, when we're thinking about kind of like lines of influence, and and how it goes. I have to admit, I mean, partly because I read the Octoroom before I read the Garys and their friends, I kind of assumed that Boucicault's play came first. And that
Mhm.
McCloskey sort of like was, because of
Copy, yeah.
Boucicault, was
Yeah.
came into the sort of American vernacular as this kind of figure. But in fact, Webb's novel is first.
Oh.
It actually is the Black American writer who
Oh.
I don't know. So I don't know
Yeah.
whether Boucicault, whether there's any
Who
reason
copy
to
too,
think that.
right?
Right. Well, certainly Webb didn't copy Boucicault, right?
Right. Right.
So if anything, it's Webb who's put
Hmm.
this kind of a particular kind of like interesting understanding of the
Right.
relationship of Irishness to race. Um, that then, and I can't say that Boucicault's intentionally um referring to Webb, but that in a way, in terms of how it gets into the air, how it gets
Hmm.
into
Yeah.
kind of like, well, if you want a brutish Irish person, his name is McCloskey, right? Like, why not,
Right.
right?
Right. Right. Yeah.
And that Webb seems to put that into circulation in a certain kind of way.
Yeah. No, it's fascinating. That's really interesting. How all this connects and interacts with one another. But let's turn to turn to the race aspects that, I mean, it's in the title of your book, so it is an important part of your story. And like it sort of cuts two different ways, right? In part, there's sort of the aspect where you're talking about Irish as sort of being oftentimes presented or perceived or treated as a racial inferior people. But then there's the other aspect of slavery, chattel slavery, and sort of how people from Ireland interact with that, and especially individuals like John Mitchell or um, now I'm blanking on his name, going to Louisiana, right? So it's
Right,
like
Boucicault, yeah.
Busico, and it's like it's this kind of really, it seems like interconnected issue, right? Of sort of like, where do we belong in all of this? That kind of connects these two problems.
Hmm, hmm. Yeah, I think that's right. And I do think that that's important, and I do think that um, it's really complicated, and there's a
Hmm.
there's a long and complicated uh, history. Um, and it is certainly the case that that sort of that kind of like the oppression of Ireland
Hmm.
from England, right? Like
Right.
Mitchell's right about this, right? Is longstanding and
Yeah.
is brutal
Hmm.
and certainly when a lot of the writers that I'm looking at in the 1850s of all decades, right? Like as in the aftermath of the
Yeah.
Great Famine, um, they're sort of horrific.
Yeah.
Um, um, just degradation and discrimination
Hmm.
and all kinds of
Yeah.
all kinds of things.
Yeah.
Um, the question of race was um, in relationship to Irishness and the way that we use
Hmm.
the the language of race
Hmm. Yeah.
is one that I think is um, part of the book's sort of animating arguments.
Hmm.
And I'm arguing against something that has become in some ways a commonplace in a lot of Irish studies,
Hmm.
or wanting to complicate the commonplace um, in Irish studies and particularly in strands of what's called Irish post-colonial studies.
Hmm.
Um, and that is the idea that the Irish, when they came to the United States, became white,
Hmm.
And sort of like um you know
Right. It's a character
worked.
shames, right?
Yeah,
Like
right,
you're going
yeah.
from this oppressed colonial
Oppressed thing
person
into whiteness,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
And that, whereas that they weren't, and so they had to become white because they
right.
weren't white within the kind of like context of the
Yeah.
what was the United Kingdom,
Hmm.
right? I mean,
Yeah. Yeah.
remember in the 19th century, right?
Yeah.
We're talking
Yes.
about a time like after the Act of Union,
Hmm.
at the beginning of the century and before
Right. Yeah.
Irish independence. So um so there's and that's a really important argument. It's an argument that was sort of like especially um, given salience and given a kind of language
Mm.
by an important scholar at the end of the 20th century named Noel Ignatieff, with his book called How the Irish Became White. And then after this is the sort of like,
Hmm.
the kind of the argument. And Ignatieff was primarily an Americanist, and he wanted to tell a story, and I think he tells a really sort of important story of the
Right.
role of Irishness within the American racial regimes. I mean, I really
Right.
think it is a
Yeah.
really important story, but there's a kind of, in order to make this
Mm.
kind of like overall argument work, he has to kind of like suggest that they weren't white before they got there,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
And then that becomes a story, and that's
Yeah.
where I want to like push back on.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, and it's
and
also so dependent on where you lived as an Irish person, where you lived in New York, where you were Irish, and that was indifference to English or Scottish or Germanness, or you were in the West, and
sure,
we
right,
don't care. You were
right.
white. It didn't
You're
matter
right,
where you
right,
came
yeah,
from. Yeah.
right. Or when if you're in the American South, I mean,
Right. Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
there's an assumption that people of Irish descent, within the enslaving American South were largely not enslavers. They didn't have the
Hmm.
money, and to some extent, there were a lot of people who didn't have
Right.
money, right?
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah, of
right,
course.
and so but there's an assumption that something like Gone with the Wind, right, which is
Hmm.
written
Right. Yeah.
in the early 20th century, but which is reflecting back on the from the 1850s on, through the Civil War and into Reconstruction, but there's an assumption that that's a kind of um, a sort of fantasy that there could be an Irish family,
Hmm.
that was an enslaving family, on
Right.
a plantation like Tara. Um, and of course, there were a lot
Yeah,
of impoverished.
of course.
There were a lot of impoverished uh, people of Irish descent in the American South,
Right.
in the 1850s and later. But there are also actually a lot of people of Irish descent, and even and Irish immigrants to the United States who were enslavers,
Right.
and that's I mean, again, my institution is Georgetown University, and we over the past several
Yeah.
years
Yeah.
have had a real sort of like accounting and a kind of call for
Right.
accountability
Yeah.
of Georgetown, because in the 1830s, Georgetown was able to continue in a way to exist as a college because of the sale of almost
Right.
300 human beings,
Right.
right,
Yeah.
in into the deeper South,
Yeah.
and
Not the proud
that
history.
right, yeah, that right, exactly. I mean, that the funds that were raised by the
Mhm.
sale of human beings, by not only by Jesuits but by Irish Jesuits,
Right. Yeah.
right,
Yeah.
is sort of like part of how Georgetown remained solvent, right, in the 19th century, right? So
Hmm.
so like something like that happened, right? And
Right.
that's
Yeah.
so that happened. If people um go to Charleston, in South
Hmm.
Carolina, there is one of the um sort of central names in Charleston in South Carolina, in terms of the sale of human beings and the sale
Hmm.
of chattel enslaved human beings, is Ryan.
Yeah.
And that's he's Irish,
Yeah.
right? So it's not in fact the case that there were not even in the American South that there were not Irish enslavers. Oscar Wilde's uncle
Right. Yeah.
was an
Yeah.
enslaver, was a participant um
Yeah.
in
And
this sort of the
it's
Confederate Constitution,
it's
right?
so easy. Like I remember giving a conference in um Booterong in Northwest Ireland, and like this one guy I talked about like my research topic and kind of like how these interpretations about like Irish status kind of influenced the way they looked at chattel slavery at the South.
Mhm.
And the guy kind of was like, well, just because they lived in the South, it's all regional. And I was like, it's not all regional. It is
Yeah,
really dependent on like what how willing are you to kind of embrace that culture
yeah,
of the
yeah,
region you're living in, and whether you're
yeah.
willing to kind of stand against it too,
Stand
right?
against
Like
it.
I
That's
mean,
right.
John Mitchell
Yeah,
starts in New York and then he moves to the South
yeah, right.
because
Yes.
he finds it more interesting, or
Yeah,
kind of
right.
more
Right.
welcoming as a
More welcoming
place.
in a way, right? Yeah. So I got really interested in this kind of question, right?
Mhm,
And I got interested both in well in two things. One, in um the ways in which the 19th century Irish in Ireland, while absolutely oppressed, were not that their oppression was not necessarily, was
mhm,
understood racially in a certain kind of way, and that's really
mhm,
important, but did not make them equivalent to enslaved Black people in the United States.
mhm.
Right. And
Yeah,
so because
right,
they were
right,
understood, even though they were understood as in some ways degraded, or
right.
in
Yeah, yeah.
various ways, that their whiteness was largely sort of like a foundation
Right.
of that kind of
Yeah.
understanding. And in fact, I mean, Mitchell is a great example, right? But he's not the only one um, of Irish people making the argument
Mhm,
that the oppression, both that they are sort of like treated as though they are Black
mhm.
by the British government, and
Yeah.
that this is especially bad because they're white.
Right.
Right. And so that double
Yes.
kind of
Yeah.
move,
Yeah.
right? Like is the sort of thing that I was kind of like interested in tracing there. And
Right.
there are some, and this this notion of the kind of like um we're treated as though we're Black, but it's especially bad because we're
Mhm.
white, comes up again and again in the 19th century, and not only in the United States among sort of like Irish Americans, but also in Ireland itself.
Mhm.
I mean, like, there's an early-ish quote, and it's actually not by an Irish guy, but it's about Ireland, but a quote that I find really interesting. So Lord Byron, the
Mhm.
poet, right?
Yeah.
The
Mhm.
poet that
Yep. Yep.
that the sort of infamous, the controversial
Yeah. But
poet,
the
but
one who
also
really stands out for the oppressed,
right,
usually,
yes, a
right?
radical,
Yeah.
right, absolutely a radical,
Yeah.
and then and who dies fighting for Greek
Greek
independence,
independence.
right,
Can't be
um,
more romantic than
than
that,
that.
right?
So in 1812, he's actually in the House of Lords, and I think it's maybe his second speech in the House of Lords, so it's really early in his career, and it's on
Hmm.
Catholic emancipation.
Hmm. Right.
Um, and
But it's
and
still
so
far away in many ways.
which is still far
Yeah.
away in many ways, right? And of course, it's this interesting term,
Yeah.
emancipation, right? And the kind
Yeah.
of slippage between sort of like emancipation,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of what we call
Right.
Catholic emancipation,
Right. Like,
and emancipation of enslaved people, but it's on Catholic emancipation. He's in support of it, of course,
right.
right?
Yeah.
And he makes the argument that he sort of makes the argument like, look, we in Britain abolished the Atlantic slave trade, right,
Mm-hmm.
in 1807. Um, and he actually makes the what I think sort of like bizarre argument that Catholic emancipation is in some ways more pressing because the Catholic Irish have petitioned
Hmm.
Parliament for this,
Right.
whereas enslaved Black people never petitioned Parliament, apparently for the abolishment of the Atlantic slave trade, which
Bit
is
hard when you're
absurdity,
enslaved.
right? Right, yeah. Well, it's a bit hard when you're enslaved, but it's also not true. I mean, like
Right. Yeah.
someone like Huguano at the end of the 18th century is
Right. Yeah.
absolutely
Of course they are.
making the
Yeah.
argument. So Byron, so Byron said about Catholic emancipation, but about Ireland in particular, and the kind of um, the kind of oppression in Ireland. He says, "For myself, I pity the Catholic peasantry for not having the good fortune to be born Black." It's an astonishing
Yeah.
quotation,
Yeah. I mean, that's
right? It's an
like
astonishing
sort of like
quotation, but
saying that if you were black, you would have a lot more abilities
yeah,
to.
yes, that's right. Because Parliament is going to come and abolish the Atlantic slave
Yeah.
trade without you even
Yeah.
having to ask for it. But here,
Yeah. And you're
right, like
fighting and
it's
fighting and
even
you're not
worse,
going
and you're not
anywhere.
going anywhere, and it's even right.
Yeah.
This kind of association, what I think, I mean, in a way, I mean, again, Byron is a radical.
Mm. Yeah.
Byron, he's making this argument in what he thinks is a kind of way of freeing people, right?
Right.
But that he could so easily slip into this notion that it's even worse,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Which it's not, right? That
Right.
it's like
Um,
it's sort of like
yeah,
Southerners saying we're enslaved people because we can't take our human property everywhere in the country,
everywhere, right?
right? Like,
Exactly, right. Yes, right, exactly. I mean, so and Daniel O'Connell, another amazing
yeah,
voice
yeah,
here in Ireland, both for sort of like Catholic enfranchisement,
right,
but for the abolition of slavery as well. I mean, he was
yeah,
really, really important in that, and that
mhm,
leads to or it's one of the things that really leads to sort of Mitchell's disavowal
yeah,
of O'Connell. Um, so again, a guy that I have, in a lot of ways,
hmm,
you want to have a tremendous amount of respect for. Um, he in 1814, he makes the argument about how things haven't gotten better, right?
hmm,
Like things haven't gotten better in Ireland.
right,
And he says, I flattered myself that is the sort of the Irish or the Catholic
hmm,
Irish had risen in Protestants' estimation. He said, I did imagine we had ceased to be whitewashed Blacks and had thrown off
I think I've
for
seen
them,
more.
for the Protestants, all traces
Mhm,
of the color of servitude. But this correspondence has, I confess, done away with the delusion. And what you keep on seeing here
mhm,
is ways in which people arguing
mhm,
for Irish rights are
right,
using the language of race,
hmm,
and they're using the language of Blackness as a kind of thing that in some ways marks it's a kind of metaphor
hmm,
for ultimate degradation
yeah,
and ultimate oppression,
yeah,
but also um, for these people marks in some ways the reason that this group of people deserves not to be that. The
hmm,
Irish deserve not to be that
yeah,
because we are not whitewashed Black people.
right, yeah,
Right,
yeah,
right. We are whites,
and
right? And that's sort of like part of the argument that's there.
yeah, and it's
Um,
it's it's kind of so interesting because we kind of both look at the same kind of material from very different angles because it's sort of like you're looking at it's like they're kind of like you want to argue against this notion of like Irish as black, and I actually read these documents in a very different way in that and this sort of the historian versus the literary critic, right, which we can nicely illustrate
yeah,
here. I
yeah,
I
yeah.
read these in sort of saying like they're thinking of themselves as enslaved people,
Yeah.
politically enslaved by the
Enslaved people,
British.
right? Yes,
And
and so
it's
they
so
use it as a metaphor, right?
yeah,
So that they
exactly.
draw upon it as a metaphor. There's a really interesting. I mean, this is now from the 1840s, but The Nation, the great nationalist
Yeah,
Irish
yeah, big
journal,
paper.
right? Yeah, really important paper, and right, and has the Mitchell connection as well.
Hmm.
But in 1847, the Nation is arguing against Irish people.
Hmm.
And this isn't the American Nation, so this is important for listeners, right?
Right,
Because
right,
there's
right.
also
Yeah,
the
yeah, yeah.
American, right? There's the Journal in the United
Yep.
States, which is the Nation, right? But this is the Irish one. Um, and um, and they're arguing against Irish people throwing their support um in a kind of like public or collective
Hmm.
way toward abolition.
Right.
Um, I mean, whatever individuals do, right? The individuals do, and they kind of like, again, I mean, you're absolutely, they draw the connection and
Hmm.
then draw the line between it.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah,
That's the kind of thing. You draw the connection, draw the line between it. They write, we have really so very urgent affairs at home.
yeah.
So much abolition of white slavery to effect, if we
Hmm.
can, that all our exertions will be needed in Ireland.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
And so that's the kind of thing, right? Like, yeah, so draw the connection, then draw the line, right?
Right. Yeah.
And so one of the figures in the book that's a really, I think, just a major kind of thinker, a 19th century thinker that I've learned a tremendous amount from, I would have to say, and that is in some ways the 19th century writer and thinker who has provided me with, for me, the most kind of like powerful ways of thinking both about connections, but then also the importance of differences, is Frederick Douglass. Frederick
Hmm.
Douglass
Yeah.
went to Ireland. Frederick
Right.
Douglass toured in Ireland. Um, uh, his his um, his book sold well in Ireland.
Yeah.
He met with abolitionists in Ireland. Um, Frederick Douglass has one of those sort of like famous famous sort of like shock of John Mitchell's
Hmm.
um, um, sort enthusiasm
Hmm.
for the American slave system, when someone like Douglas would have expected that Mitchell
Right.
would be on the side of abolition.
Right. And
Um,
it's sometimes so fascinating when these people that everyone expect to be in favor of something end up on the
and they're
other
not,
side,
right?
right?
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
it's
yeah. Douglas is just shocked, I
yeah.
think, at this, right? And then, but Douglas is when Douglas is doing the lecture tour in 1845, I think, in Ireland.
Hmm.
One of the things that keeps on happening
Hmm.
is that, I mean, and I want, and it's important, right?
Hmm.
The Irish took to this, right? Like they came to
Yeah.
these, there was enthusiasm, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
For it. Douglas, sort of, I'd say proudly, right,
Hmm.
wrote back to the States that that he was dubbed the Black O'Connell of the United States, and for his oratory, for his
Yeah.
rhetoric, for the
Yeah.
power of his
Yeah.
words, right?
And
Um,
that's something very big for the Irish,
and that's
that
something really big.
oratory.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
But one of the things that keeps on happening, right? And it doesn't just happen once, but happens repeatedly, is that enthusiastic Irish people come up to him
Hmm.
after his talks, and sort of, thank him
Hmm.
for it, and say this is really important to us
Hmm.
because we are also enslaved.
Right. And
And Douglas has to keep saying again and again, he's saying, he says, look, I am against all oppression.
hmm.
And so I'm absolutely against the oppression that you Irish people are facing
Right.
within the United Kingdom.
Right.
That
That's
is
nuts.
absolutely true,
Hmm.
but you are not enslaved.
Yeah. Yeah.
because there's a difference
Mm-hmm.
between what's happening here
Right.
and what's happening in the United
Right.
States.
Yeah.
For as oppressed as you are,
There's still
Douglas
rights, right?
argues, right? Yeah, right. There's a kind of sense that there is, yeah, there's a kind of like sense that there is a human being
Right. Yeah. A certain dignity.
who can enter into contracts,
Yeah.
right? Who can,
Yeah.
right? Who can
Mm-hmm.
bring lawsuits, right? Or
Right. Yeah.
something,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Something like that, right?
At least you can
There's
get a
a
trial. Yeah.
right, yeah, there's an ownership of the self, even if
Mm-hmm.
there's political oppression. There's a kind
Right.
of sense of an ownership of the self, and Douglas says that that is what has been robbed from us,
Mm-hmm.
from Black people in the United States, is that
Right.
we
No.
like we've been taken away. And so for me, I think that this was really powerful for me, for sort of
Mm-hmm.
thinking about, like, yes, Douglas says, he sort of says, like, there are rhymes
Mm-hmm.
across the Atlantic between these situations, but they are not analogous.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of, like, there are rhymes, to bring another
Right.
literary term, right?
Yeah.
There's something
Yeah.
that rhymes,
Right.
but
But it's not the same.
it's not the same.
Yeah.
And that Douglas keeps on saying that, and that's one of the things in this book that was really important to me,
Mm-hmm.
was to say, as much as, like, whenever we're writing about kind of like oppression, violence,
Mm-hmm.
colonial brutality,
Yeah.
economic, right,
Right. Right.
brutality,
Yeah.
the famine,
Mm-hmm.
right, transportation,
Yeah.
indentured servitude, right? I mean, like, there's all kinds of things that we can write about, and think about it. And this absolutely true in terms of Irish precarity, in terms of Irish suffering, in terms of the violence of Irish history. But that I think that we need to be really careful about, um, I think that we need to respect, for me anyway, both as a kind of, like, a thinker, a scholar,
Mm-hmm.
but actually, to the extent that I'm any kind of,
Right.
literary historian, cultural historian, right? I think that we need to respect the kind of uniqueness, um, of Black experience, of
Mm-hmm.
of Black dispossession,
Yeah.
and of Black resilience, and that whenever we're wanting to, um, kind of like coalition build, which is
Mm-hmm.
something that both someone like O'Connell Douglas are really, interested in doing in the 19th century.
Mm-hmm.
But that whenever we want a coalition build, we have to kind of, like, recognize that coalition um, does not mean that that the histories are exactly the same,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Right.
That's a
Yeah.
coalition across
Right.
difference.
Yeah.
And it's my sense um, that Douglas understands that,
Yeah. Yeah.
and that he makes the point. And
Well, and for the
um,
Irish, it's the argument of political exigency, right? That it's like, oh, this works for us because we can create sympathy and
yes,
relate
that's right.
to another
Right.
cause.
That's right. Absolutely right. Yeah, it's about kind of like, it's in a way using this kind of,
Right.
language in order to, yeah,
Yeah.
right, yeah, to kind of say, look, it is like this thing, and if you think
Yeah.
that thing is bad,
Yeah.
you should
Yeah.
think this thing is bad. Um,
And
I, I
it's
mean,
kind of like I was thinking like it's pretty easy when like you have the similar language like plantations in Ireland, plantations in North
that's
America,
right.
right? And like
Emancipation,
yeah,
right?
emancipation,
Yeah, yeah.
this like abolition or
Abolition, right? Yeah,
like liberator and all
right.
these terminologies
Yeah.
that they kind of come
Well,
up with.
yeah, well, and the language of slavery, right? Right,
Right, yeah,
which the Irish,
very much embrace
you very
for
much embrace
themselves.
for
Yeah.
themselves, right? Thomas More, the poet who I
Mm-hmm.
mentioned before, that Poe
Yeah.
was, reading and thinking about, Thomas More,
Yeah.
writes, around 1840, born of Catholic parents,
Yeah.
I come into the world with a slave's yoke around my neck. And it's like, well,
Not
No, no,
quite, no.
not really quite, right?
Yeah.
And that those
Mhm.
differences really matter. And I think they
Right.
matter. I think they matter in the other way also. I mean, one of the ways in which it's not only from the kind of like pro-Irish side, although that's what we've been talking about, right?
Hmm.
The
No, it's of
Byrons and the
course.
O'Connells and the Mitchells for that,
Yeah.
for that matter, from the pro-Irish side, but also, it is absolutely the case that caricaturists, for example,
Hmm.
in both the United Kingdom and the United States, um, um, caricature Irishness in a kind of racialized
Right. Yeah.
way.
Yeah.
Um,
Kind of the way their
often,
drawings
right.
on. Hmm.
Well, and there's the famous in the United States, right? There's the famous Nast
Yeah.
drawing from
Yeah, exactly. I was thinking of
from
that.
Harper's, right, with
Hmm.
the scales, the kind of Reconstruction era with the scales, of a kind of like balancing out, and so the black
Yeah.
vote and the Irish
Yeah.
vote are balancing themselves out, and
Yeah.
this is something that's sort of been said, like, look, these two faces are looking at each other. Look, there's a line, there's a connection
Yeah.
that's being drawn,
Yeah.
between these two caricatures, these two kind of like
Hmm.
racial caricatures. One of the
Yeah.
things that's often ignored about this thing is that Nast is actually drawn underneath it black and white. Like
Right.
the point is, yes, that white, that the Irish are white, and that they are
Yes.
kind of problematic,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
within a kind of
Exactly.
like politics,
Yeah.
and
The
and
difficulty
so
of the contemporaries even muddying the waters,
the
right?
Motters, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So there are a number of caricatures, especially in the London-based journal,
Hmm.
Punch, in the mid 19th century.
Hmm.
The caricature Irish people, especially working class Irish people,
Hmm.
or um, or activists, or Fenian
Yeah.
activists, right? With kind of these kind of like racialized,
Hmm.
what's often called so Simeonized. They look kind of like monkeys. These images, but one of the things that struck, and so there's that line, right?
Hmm.
That connect, right? But one of the things that struck me about those images is that in general in the 19th century, the way that the caricature works is that it's insulting. It thinks that it wants to be insulting Irish people to suggest by
Yeah.
suggesting that they are similar in some way to
Yeah.
racist caricatures of black people,
Yeah. Right.
right? So
Yeah.
the insult to the Irish,
Hmm.
so that the way that these are not images that
Hmm.
these images are assuming the
Yeah.
racist caricature of black people,
Hmm.
and then insulting the Irish by being like that
Right.
caricature,
Yeah.
right? Because the Irish in a way there are being insulted because in a way they have whiteness to lose by
Yeah. Yeah.
being brought into
Yeah.
this.
And they kind of bring it like they kind of making these arguments that they are like different, oppressed, kind of like that opens the door to it almost
To
too.
almost, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
Mm.
There's a what's become in Irish studies a sort of famous quotation from a letter by the novelist and author, Charles Kingsley, and he's traveling around Ireland, and he writes back to his wife, um, there, and he's in County Sligo,
Mm.
so in the west,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
he writes, and this quote becomes very kind of, this becomes the kind of like, oh, look, the Irish are understood as though they are like people of African descent because the
Yeah.
same kind of like racist terms are used for them.
Hmm.
He says, I'm haunted by the human chimpanzees I saw along that 100 miles of horrible country. To see white
Yikes.
chimpanzees is dreadful. If they were
Hmm.
black, one would not feel it so much, but their skins, except where tanned by exposure, are as white as ours. And this is one
Yeah.
of these
Yeah.
kind of like
Yeah.
quotes that's often used to say, look,
Yeah.
there's a connection, right? This
Hmm.
kind of like
Yeah.
racist terminology is a similar
Right.
racist terminology. But
Yeah.
what strikes me kind of like, and absolutely, yeah, there's that connection. But what strikes me is like the next line is, and why this is especially horrible is because they are white.
Yeah. Right,
And
right,
if
right.
they were Black, it would not feel as horrible.
Visible.
And it's like,
Hmm. Total racism right there.
total racism right
Yeah,
there.
yeah.
Absolutely.
No, it's crazy. And in part, as we're kind of talking about it all, I kind of like the more you think about it, right? The more like this argument of yours is important, is essential, because there's like all these white Southerners who are kind of like, no, 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 like today, right? They're
Yeah,
saying like, no,
yeah,
no, no, today, oh, African Americans weren't the first slaves, so Irish were the first slaves to
yeah,
come
yeah.
into America, and you're kind of like, no, 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 that doesn't work, like.
Yeah.
And
And
I think in that argument you're making is very important to kind of go against these sort of notions. Like, yes, of course, at the time people truly like bought into it because they kind of wanted to draw connections to their oppression, but
yeah.
it creates a false analogy
Yeah,
between the Irish situation and what African
yeah,
Americans in the South
yeah.
experienced.
There's a phrase that I found um really really powerful. Um um and it comes from a scholar and writer um named Frank Wilderson, and he uses the phrase the ruse of analogy. And I think it's like really
Yeah,
powerful,
yeah,
and it's like
yeah.
it's kind of like what I was sort of like thinking about in this book. And so he's another kind of like really important uh scholar of color, right? Who I
Mm-hmm.
think that we should be kind of like reading and thinking about.
Yeah.
Um, and that the way that now that and this is related to, like, this is how I come in some ways,
Mm-hmm.
I owe this to Wilderson, that I come to this kind of like argument about genre, because genre creates analogies, right? Like that's
Mm-hmm.
the way that
Yeah.
genre works, right? Like
Yeah.
we recognize something as a sonnet, not
Mm-hmm.
because the sonnet is something that was given at the beginning of time by God or something like that, but because it has some kind of analogous
Mm-hmm.
features to something else that we've understood as a sonnet,
Yeah.
right? And so that the way that genre works is through analogy. And
Mm-hmm.
but Wilderson makes what I think is just this excellent point that analogy also deceives. Analogy is a ruse.
Mm-hmm.
Analogy can be a kind of trap
Right.
that that we
Right.
that we start to um assume that the analogy starts to um make us think that things are equivalent or the same when
Right.
when they
Where
may
they're
not
not.
be,
Yeah.
when
Yeah.
they might not be. And he in that section where I mean, he uses the term ruse of
Mm-hmm.
analogy a couple of times, but in one of those sections he talks specifically um, about what he calls the grammar of Black suffering.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's also just so kind of like powerful, right? That
Right.
that it's that um, we need to be really careful about appropriating
Mm-hmm.
and I mean, from
Yeah.
my perspective, I love the fact that he's using the language of grammar, right? He's using the
Right.
language of
Right.
all right, of language there, but kind of like we need to be really careful of appropriating the
Mm-hmm.
structures of
Yeah.
someone else's history,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
someone else's suffering, and and also someone else's resilience,
Yeah.
and
Exactly.
someone else's, right.
And it doesn't
So
take away from your suffering. It just means
that's right.
we have to use a different
We have to
language
use a
to
different language
describe
or be
it.
really
Right.
right, absolutely. And I think that, so I mean, to your point about now, I think that for me this was um as I was writing this book, this was a kind of way in which I was writing this book in a kind of almost like a fugue state of a kind of horror at the
Mm-hmm.
ways in which Irish precarity was being mobilized,
Right. Right.
like
Yeah.
now,
Yeah.
right, in our
Yeah.
in our own time, by
Mm-hmm.
by far right groups,
Yeah.
in order in actually in the service of anti-Black racism, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
actually
Right.
deploying Irish precarity
Right.
specifically in the service of
Yeah,
anti-Black
kind of
racism.
downplay African
Yeah,
American suffering, right? Of like,
suffering,
oh, the
right?
Irish
Yeah.
were the same, so why are
Right. Yeah.
you
Why are you
complaining,
right?
right?
I mean, right. Yeah. And then I mean, this goes back to Mitchell, right? This is a
Yeah,
19th
yeah.
century sort of like, connection, right? And so I was kind of like,
Mitchell.
right, thinking about that. But one
Yeah.
of the things I also also thought about, and I think is really important is that I do think that in this kind of post-colonial Irish, there is really good and influential and powerful
Hmm.
post-colonial Irish studies scholarship of the
Hmm.
1980s and 1990s that is asking these questions,
Hmm.
is asking the kind of the questions of the relationship um, between blackness and Irishness in the 19th
Hmm.
century or in the 18th century. And some of these are great, Noel Ignatieff is one of these. Theodore
Yeah.
Allen is another one of them. David Roediger, the great labor
Hmm.
historian,
Hmm.
right, is another one of them in an incredibly, I think, thoughtful and nuanced way, right? Like
Right. Yeah.
I really think that he's doing sort of like fantastic work. And um, as well as a lot of kind of like post-colonial Irish studies
Yeah.
folk. And and so I don't want to discount the importance of
Hmm.
that work. And in particular, what I don't want to discount is that what that work opens up, as
Hmm.
well as the work of others, someone like Nell Irvin Painter, the
Hmm.
historian, opens up is sort of like thinking about whiteness as itself having a history and being constructed rather than being simply
Hmm.
the norm
Right.
against which racial otherness is measured, right? Like
Right.
whiteness
Yeah.
doesn't, there's a certain kind of way in which whiteness is sometimes understood as not as just being the standard
Hmm.
against which difference is measured. And I
Yeah.
think that a lot of these the post-colonial Irish studies scholars, the labor scholars, all working in these topics in the 1980s and 1990s. The historians of whiteness like Painter
Hmm.
did incredibly important work
Right.
in opening up that question,
Yeah.
right? In doing that, but um, what what I was thinking about is, as I was writing this book at this time, and now is that I feel that we need, in a way, to we need to build on that and to
Hmm.
kind of like find the differences as well as the coalitions and the
Yeah.
similarities
Yeah.
and stuff like that. And kind of like have a wake-up call to those of us
Hmm.
who are in the academy and who care about racial justice,
Hmm.
to for us now, to stop making our own kind of like somewhat under theorized equivalencies, right, between the
Hmm.
experiences
Yeah.
of Irish people and those of Black people,
Yeah.
even
Yeah.
if the equivalencies are well intended, right?
Right.
And that
Yeah.
we need to kind of like think about now, like in the world that we are now,
Hmm.
um, not erasing or eliminating or canceling, right? This kind of like important work that has come before us, but to figure out ways of building coalitions
Yeah.
for justice across race
Hmm.
without erasing the specificity of Black experience
Right.
through
Yeah.
analogy.
Right. Right. Exactly. Exactly. Ew. We have been at it about an hour and a half now, so
Yeah, well, thank you. This has been this is a great conversation.
yeah,
And I
like
really
it's very
appreciate all of your
enlightening.
questions.
It's very enlightening. I'm kind of looking at my talking points. I think you kind of covered like on your own without me even kind of trying to direct you in most of those
Well,
in
I
some form or
really,
another.
I really appreciate that kind of questions. I really appreciate
No, it's very
the,
interesting, and
I
I mean, like,
appreciate that you've read the book and thought about the book.
yeah, no, like as once you got like for me, of course, John Mitchell was the most interesting part because I have written about John Mitchell myself, and kind of for me it was more sort of like understanding like where does this racism come from, like the
Yeah.
little experience he has with it, right? Like it's only in
Right,
Brazil that he sees slavery
right,
before he comes to the United States. So like how does he turn this racist attitude on?
right.
And so it's very interesting. Like I find it very interesting, and like I
Yeah.
really like talking to you and kind of like reading the book. It kind of really kind of forced me to kind of even think about my own work and kind of be like, there are a couple of things I probably should have done a little differently now.
Well,
But
I
that's
mean,
always the
thank you.
way we learn
Yeah,
from each
yeah,
other,
yeah. Thank you. I really
right?
appreciate that. It's awfully kind.
Yeah.
And if it can have, if my book can have some small effect in the world, that I'm grateful for that. But I do think, I mean, I'd say from right, as you said, and from where we started the conversation, like where this book come from. I mean, in a lot of ways, this book came out of something that I was writing about and publishing on
Right.
that I started to feel that I was doing wrong in
Yeah.
some kind of like kind of important way to sort of wrestle with, and
Yeah.
that um and that
I mean, it's always right. We
mistake,
write
yeah,
something because we feel that there's something that we can contribute to the understanding of the world that has both meaning in its time that we write about, but also in the time that we live in. That
that we're living
is,
in. That's right. That's right.
it's this duality of right, like I look at my work and I'm like, I want to understand why the world is so interconnected, how people are interacting with one another, but then
Right.
also to remind people today when we're like, oh, globalization is something new, or like this exchange of ideas is something so new and alien and hot and dangerous for us. And you're like, no, no, it's always been there. It's just it's
That's right.
different. It's a little different
It's a
today.
little different, and from my perspective, I mean, like, and this is, I mean, to go back to also your question from the beginning about method.
Mhm.
I mean, I think, and historians obviously do this also, but I think that one of the things that we are sort of like hyper conscious of as literary critics is when we are thinking about both connections
Mhm.
between the present and the past,
Yeah.
but also differences. One of the things that we're kind of obsessed with or look
Right.
at and wrestle with is language, right? And
Yeah.
the, and the
Yeah.
and the and
Exactly.
the ways in which language matters to the
Mhm.
way that we understand. Um, Painter has a great article from The Guardian, so sort of like public facing journalism,
Mhm.
with a headline that's the way that we think about the word enslaved matters. And I
Mhm.
think that is super important, and she's absolutely
Right.
right.
Yeah.
That we need to be, we need to think about our language, but we also, it's about sort of unpacking the way that language shapes
Mhm.
how we think and how they thought
Yeah.
and how we think
Yeah.
about them and how they would have
Yeah.
thought about their future, right? And
Right.
so,
Like we
yeah,
tell students all the time, word choice matters.
word choice matters. Yeah.
Yeah. Like
And
the
that's what
right
the book's
word
about.
is such an important like, choice. Like, if we
Yes,
use the wrong word, it sends a completely different meaning, or
that's right.
overplay something or underplay something. So, but in this, like, again, Patrick, thank you so much for joining me tonight or this morning for you. Again, if you're interested in, if we kind of whet your appetite and you need a Guinness to go with a good book, Patrick's book is The Irish and the Imagination of Race, White Supremacy Across the Atlantic in the 19th Century. And you can get the book from the University of Virginia Press if you are interested. Again, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for talking with me and for inviting me on, and thank you to people listening. So thanks.